He lived in a big house, he had a private education.
Daniel's parents had split up when he was 9 years old, and so he lived in Nottingham with his mother and younger brother.
He was just a boy next door. You know, if you saw him in the street, you wouldn't look at him twice. He was sort of a normal guy.
Simon Matters met Daniel's mother, Jacqueline, in 2008 when Daniel was 11 years old. He dated Jacqueline for around 2 years. During this period, he spent a lot of time with her and her 2 boys. He initially saw Daniel as a child with a lot of potential.
Hi, this is Daniel.
Daniel was talented and would earn pocket money fixing his friends' computers.
Daniel was very, very clever. He was doing stuff at 12 years old that I wouldn't have known what to do at that time. He knew about computers, could take a computer apart and mend laptops that were broken. Jackie was quite proud of the fact he could do stuff like that.
Is that a good camera angle?
He also enjoyed filming himself and then posting the videos on YouTube.
Hello YouTube, this is Daniel AB1702 here.
In 2009, when Daniel was 12, his mother decided to move the family to a smaller house in a different area of Nottingham. Daniel was also taken out of his private school and enrolled into a state school.
And it was at that point, when she decided to move house, that the behaviour got worse.
Having to leave his private school, having to move to a smaller house in a different neighbourhood, it was all seen to be his mother's fault, according to Daniel.
It seems likely that he was annoyed and angry with her, frustrated because she had separated from his father. Often the mother gets blamed for not being more forceful to save the marriage or to help the son.
He became reclusive and spent more time alone in his bedroom watching DVDs and television. He posted clips of his favourite TV soaps on YouTube, but the clips were mostly violent.
He'd actually built up this private world for himself, this whole way of thinking about things that was completely separate from reality, really.
Glimpses into Daniel's violent fantasy world were seen by those around him when he started to write fictional stories.
It was sort of 7 o'clock on a weekday night, and he'd come down and showed me a story, and it was sort of quite gory about someone getting killed and some fight at school, and this kid had gone back and killed another kid, and read it and gave it back to him, and he showed his mother. And again, his mum was the same as me, just sort of read it, and she was like, Daniel, what are you writing that for?
That can be read in a number of different ways. He's seeking a reaction. He's sensation-seeking himself. It's also quite manipulative, because this is simply a way of drawing attention to himself because he feels he deserves that attention.
Daniel liked to shock people with things he did and said. He liked people to focus on him.
Daniel was displaying attention-seeking behaviour outwardly, but in the privacy of his bedroom, he was acting in troubling and bizarre ways.
He had many very expensive figurines of the Star Wars characters and Doctor Who characters. They'd just be all ruined. He'd have plastic boxes full of figures, but he'd urinated in the boxes. He'd also defecated all over the bedroom in boxes and hidden towels and stuff that he'd wiped himself with. And one of the things I found which disturbed me, but actually Jackie laughed about it, I found a bag of her underwear. Obviously I mentioned it to Jack and she was like, oh my God. But she brushed over it to say, well, he was just having a prank, just messing about. And she actually said, I wondered where they'd gone. I wondered why I was running out of underwear, sort of thing. So it was brushed under at the time, but later on, obviously, it became a bit more sinister.
I think there's lots of underlying psychosexual behaviours in terms of Bartlam and what he ultimately did. We shouldn't ignore the fact that a 14-year-old boy is going to be developing sexual feelings, and in relation to Bartlam, will not know how to handle those sexual feelings.
In this private room that Daniel created for himself, as well as destroying the Star Wars figures and defecating, as a 15-year-old, 14-year-old boy, he was probably masturbating a lot and probably taking things that would feed his masturbatory fantasies. And the underwear from his mother that he stole could well have been part of that whole process. And that also became part of his internal fantasy life that really became more than a fantasy. It became a plan of what he was going to do.
What Daniel planned to do was commit murder. And he was about to act out his fantasy in a cold and calculated way.
He'd covered all aspects of a murder and how to do one, if you like, and get away with it. He'd covered everything. Been speaking to people, going to school, and all the time, you know, on that particular day, he knew that he was going to murder his mum.
14-year-old Daniel Bartlam lived in a quiet suburb of Nottingham with his mother, Jacqueline.
We need your suggestions.
To those on the outside, he seemed a normal child, but his behavior deteriorated after his parents divorced, and he was forced to change school and move house. Daniel became withdrawn and spent more time alone. Secretly, he was engulfed in his own fantasy world.
Bartlam is engaging in a whole range of troubling and rather bizarre behaviors. He's collecting his feces. He's cutting up Star Wars figures and then urinating on them.
I don't like this camera angle.
His actions were worrying, but things were to get a lot more sinister. It was Easter Sunday, and everything seemed normal. Daniel took his pet dog to get its coat trimmed, mowed the lawn, and ate some Easter eggs. But late that night, after his family went to bed, he picked up a claw hammer and sneaked into his mother Jacqueline's bedroom. He quietly crept up behind her and then struck out, ferociously hitting her from behind.
They think that he'd hit her on the jaw first, and then hit her 6 more times in the head.
The blows were so violent, they crushed her skull.
He then put her body on the floor, wrapped it in newspaper and all the flammable material, set fire to it with petrol.
Jacqueline Bartlam's body was burned so badly she had to be identified by dental records.
He'd got his younger brother, got the dog, and ran out into the street. He was shouting that there's a burglar. Somebody's hit my mum. And that's when next-door neighbours got him in.
This is a 14-year-old boy who's carried out murder. But not only that, he's killed his mother. There are so many levels on which Daniel Bartlam's behaviour really does shock us to the core.
Daniel was interviewed by the police just hours after the murder. Far from seeming panicked, he calmly lied to detectives, telling them an intruder had broken into the house and attacked his mother. He said he'd narrowly escaped from the blazing house and had just managed to save his younger brother and family dog.
I saw that police interview with him, given it was sort of 3 or 4 hours after he'd done what he'd done. It was cool as a cucumber. No tears, no emotion, no nothing.
Police searched the house and discovered the murder weapon. It was in Daniel's bedroom, and there'd been an attempt to clean it. They now had serious doubts about Daniel's story. And when they analyzed his computer, they found he'd been researching how to commit murder.
They found stuff like how to kill people, how to dispose of bodies, how to chloroform people. He'd covered all aspects of a murder and how to sort of do one, if you like, and get away with it. He'd covered everything.
The idea that this is planned is a really concerning one, because when we see parents who are killed by children, we like to think that children have just snapped. This is in a moment of madness. They have just lost it, essentially. But this was not the case in Daniel's case. He had plotted this, he had planned it.
Which, again, is probably more scary than anything, really. In fact, he'd been living in that environment, speaking to people, going to school. And all the time, you know, on that particular day, he obviously knew that he was going to murder his mum.
When we look at some of his behaviours, we could almost categorise him as being quite psychopathic. He was lying, he was manipulative, he showed a lack of remorse for what had happened to his mother.
This is a young man who is conning, cunning. He's very plausible about the story that he initially tells the police. He's performing emotion. He is cool. We've got that cluster of behaviors which would lead me to want to label Bartlam as a psychopath.
After detectives analyzed the hard drive of Daniel's computer, they found the most shocking piece of evidence. They recovered a deleted file. It was a soap opera-style script written by Daniel. The story was about a boy called Daniel Bartlam, who'd killed his mother and had then got away with it. It showed that Daniel had meticulously planned the murder.
The only place he couldn't get away with his bad deeds was with his mother Jackie. So one evening, made it look as though there was a break-in and murdered his mother with a hammer, and then set her and the family home alight.
Daniel Bartlam was a character that had done this, but it was a soap plot. As the character in the soap, he'd got away with the murder, then got away with it in court and gone on to be some famous soap star. Longest soap star in history, I think he'd finished it off with.
Daniel Bartlam was arrested and charged with the premeditated murder of his mother. He appeared in court on the 23rd of January, 2012.
His demeanour in court was very cocky. He looked at me. He would put his finger across his throat on a number of occasions towards me. There was one occasion when I was giving evidence as a witness that I found it quite upsetting at one point, and I had to stop, and he just smiled at me. I looked across, and he was just smiling, basically.
The type of behaviour he was displaying suggests that he was quite arrogant. He had quite an inflated sense of his self-worth. He really did think that this was something that he could get away with.
But Daniel was wrong. The jury found him guilty of murdering his mother. He was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 16 years and was sent to a secure unit for children.
He's not the first child to commit murder, but there's not many children that actually plan it to the extent that he did. I still can't believe that somebody could go to those lengths at that age to do something that he did, not to anybody but to his own mum. You know, you can't fathom it.
Daniel displayed psychopathic traits and carefully planned the murder of his mother. It appeared he was carrying out a fantasy for which he showed no remorse. Killing for Daniel was personal, but for others, it's just business. 15-year-old Sontre Sanchez Gale was paid to slay a complete stranger in cold blood. He callously killed for a couple of £100 and to gain the respect of his gang.
It's about my rep on the street. It's about me as a young man going to school and everybody fearing me because they know I've stabbed somebody or I've shot somebody.
He was said to be a member of the Kensal Green Boys. They dealt in low-level street drug dealing and the like. He was very keen to make a name for himself, and he was beginning to just become associated with elder persons who were also involved in guns.
From a young age, Gale was very much left to fend for himself.
He came from a dysfunctional family. He had no real education. Nobody has ever exerted any discipline on him, either through family or schooling or anybody else, and he was very much on his own.
As a young man growing up, if you have your friends in this lifestyle and you don't really have a father figure in your life, there is a very high percentage that you're going to go down a very serious, disastrous road.
He's got a brother who's convicted of murder. He's got a cousin who's convicted of violent crime. He's going to gain status from the kind of gang culture, the petty crime culture in which he's being reared.
When children become involved in gangs, they become exposed to the gang's values, the gang's beliefs, and they begin to take those on and accept them as normal.
Gale was desperate to make a name for himself and gain higher status within his gang, the Kensal Green Boys. And it was this desire to impress that was exploited by those around him.
There came a time when he was approached by a friend of his called Isaac Billy. I really should perhaps say associate rather than friend, effectively to kill a person.
The target was Gulistan Sabasi. She was a 26-year-old Turkish woman who'd come to Britain to visit her 9-year-old son, who lived in London with his father.
Obviously, when the offer came that, you know, you can kill somebody and we'll pay you to do it, he must have thought, well, you know, this is a way of making a name for himself, because unfortunately, the more violent you are, is the bigger your name.
He can label himself a contract killer. He can label himself a hitman. The stuff of fiction, the stuff of movies, the stuff of video games.
On the 21st of March, 2010, Gale was seen on CCTV carrying out a recce of Gulistan Subasi's flat with an unknown accomplice. Even at 15 years old, he wanted to be prepared and do a professional-looking job.
Gale stalked the particular venue where the hit would take place, understood when the victim was going to be at home, disguised himself so that he was not identified on CCTV.
The next day, Gale arrived by taxi at the home of Gulistan Subasi, carrying a shotgun in his rucksack.
First of all, you just have to look at the body language on the CCTV. He was confident, knew what he was doing, didn't waste time. It's all planned.
The calm way in which he's looking around him. He could be anybody walking along the street, perhaps to make a delivery.
When Gulistan Subasi heard someone ring the door, she hoped it was her young son. The next day was his birthday, and she was desperate to give him the present she'd bought just hours earlier. Instead, it was Gale brandishing a shotgun.
And he just rang the bell, waited for the deceased to arrive at the doorstep, then boom. Cold-blooded, well executed, very frightening.
He does this in such a calm, controlled way. It really is an execution.
He is quite simply Britain's youngest hitman, Britain's youngest contract killer.
At first, the police assumed the assassin was a professional hitman. In fact, he was a schoolboy.
He's a young man. He's pulled out a gun without a second thought. And the way he's pulled it out, you can tell that there was nothing going through his mind but to kill that girl.
It was almost as if he was delivering a pizza. You know, the calm way in which he went about this was incredibly worrying.
Gale had killed Gulistan Subasi in cold blood. He did it to gain respect and status, and also for money.
He was paid a princely sum of £200. It was, all for £200.
This was, a business transaction. He was getting paid to do this. He made sure he did a good job, essentially.
Gulistan Subasi's estranged husband was initially arrested in connection to her murder. In court, it was said that he ordered the killing because he feared she would take their young son back to Turkey. He was later acquitted of all charges.
With regard to the man or men behind the contract killing, clearly Billy himself had been approached by others. To this day, it's not clear who it was.
Gale may have carried out the murder for respect and status, but he was identified to police after he made a childish mistake. Like any teenager, he couldn't help but brag, and so boasted to a friend about committing the murder.
He successfully carried out a hit. He wants to tell people about that hit. He wants to brag about it because he wants to gain the kudos within that gang of people that he's associating with of having done the contract killing.
Sondre Sanchez Gale and his recruiter, Isaac Billy, were convicted of murder at the Old Bailey and sentenced to life in prison. Gale was given a minimum of 20 years and was sent to a secure unit for children.
Although he may be only 15, he was a comparatively sophisticated and well-versed young criminal. And even despite having killed a young woman with a sawn-off shotgun, no remorse, no nothing.
The tough, do-or-die street gang culture can lead kids to kill. But even a childish dare can have deadly consequences when a pack mentality takes hold. And how can promising school kids get whipped into a frenzy so powerful they commit a brutal murder.
They were armed with a variety of weapons, butcher steels, carving knives and samurai swords.
They stabbed him to death.
How does the need to belong as a teenager lead to murder? When kids are in a group, their behavior can become frenzied and then quickly spiral horribly out of control. The violence is not premeditated and calculated, but instead it is random, chaotic, and wild.
When you are in your peer group as a teenager, as an adolescent, you essentially are all wanting to support each other. You all want to belong to that peer group. So when your friends or your associates become involved in a particular event, you also want to be involved in that event. You don't want to feel left out. You want to feel like you belong.
In 2012, a man was kicked to death outside a supermarket by young boys, simply because of a dare.
This appeared to be violence just for the sake of it, and those were the words that were used by the judge in his summing up.
On the 17th of August 2012, 3 boys were seen on CCTV roaming the empty streets of Liverpool in the middle of the night. They were 17-year-old Connor Doran and his brother, 14-year-old Brandon Doran, with their friend, 14-year-old Simon Evans. The Doran boys were from a troubled family background. Their mother had no control over them. They ran wild and would roam the streets late at night. Their older brother, Ryan, was already in prison for murdering a total stranger with a bottle in a fish and chip shop.
The Doran brothers were a violent disaster waiting to happen. They came from a family situation in which violence was a way of dealing with the world.
If you're a child growing up in an environment which says to you that violence is permissible, violence is desirable, you're going to express that in your behavior. You're going to express that culture by yourself being violent.
At 5:35 a.m., the boys were seen on CCTV outside a supermarket. A couple of hours earlier, rough sleeper Kevin Bennett was also seen at the supermarket, where he then slept in a doorway. Connor Doran, who was described as the leader of the pack, said to Simon Evans, "I bet you haven't got it in you to do him in." They hatched their plan. Brandon Doran kept watch as the other 2 boys ran around the corner, where they violently kicked and stamped on Kevin Bennett.
He suffered some horrendous injuries, broken ribs, fractured eye socket, and he died in hospital several days after the attack.
Kevin Bennett had been killed because of a childish dare.
One of the Doran boys said to Evans, "I bet you can't do him in," meaning, I bet you can't kick this particular rough sleeper to death. They're trying to say to Evans, it's permissible to do that, and if you do that, you won't be criticized by us, you will be accepted by us.
When you have children killing in groups of 2, 3, or 20, you do have a group dynamic going on, and there's that wanting to feel included, wanting to belong within the group, not wanting to lose face.
All 3 boys were convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison, to serve between 6 and 12 years. The Doran's mother, Linda, was described by the judge as a pathetic and tragic character, and she was convicted of perverting the course of justice after providing a false alibi for her sons. The Doran boys grew up in a violent family environment, and with their friend Simon Evans, prowled the streets together at night, looking for trouble. But the exhilarating power of the mob and pack mentality can make otherwise well-brought-up children turn into violent killers. In 2010, 20 promising students from a 6th form college in West London were charged with murder after running amok in one of Britain's busiest railway stations. How does being part of a large group cause good kids to turn bad?
Several of these children were kids who weren't inherently or regularly violent. These were young people who had good GCSEs, they were in their first year of A-levels, they were destined for good things.
I've spoken to the headmaster and a number of members of staff. They anticipated that a large number from this group of 20 would actually go on to further education and achieve degrees.
At the height of rush hour in Victoria Station on the 23rd of March 2010, a fight broke out between the St Charles College students and another group of schoolboys in front of shocked commuters.
There had been a very brief fight during which one of the St Charles group received a bloodied nose. That fight was broken up extremely quickly by police who were patrolling the station.
But that wasn't the end of the incident. The pupils from St Charles College plotted their revenge. They took to social media, organizing their retaliation. Plans were made as the group sent each other messages over mobile phones, BlackBerry Messenger, and Facebook.
It's fair to say there was quite a lot of geeing up and winding up, people encouraging violence, people openly discussing obtaining weapons.
What sets this case apart for me is the use of social media as a way of getting people involved in large-scale violence.
In days gone by, when groups had disagreements, they might not see each other for 2 or 3 days, and tempers would cool and things would calm down a bit. Here, there was no escape from it.
They were hyped up using Facebook, sending messages to each other, hyping each other up.
More people were getting involved, were actually being dragged in.
People got involved who may not have even known what they were getting involved in.
I just believe there was a building up, a tension, there was a winding up. There was just no escape from what was happening. Everybody was getting dragged into it.
What's happening here was that there was a tornado of violence that was building.
People just got more hyped, people got more involved, and before you know it, there were 20 men deep.
A confrontation between the two groups had been arranged at Victoria Station. It had escalated way out of control. The next day, one pupil, Victoria Osoteku, left school in her lunch hour with a boy to buy a set of kitchen knives to be used in a fight. She was seen on CCTV carrying them in a pink bag. And as the end of the school day neared, the teenagers had psyched themselves up for a violent confrontation.
You're getting to the point of frenzy. So you're thinking, so by the time school finishes or whatever, you're such in a frenzy, there's no stopping you.
They were getting caught up in the behaviour of other young people around them who were all egging each other on. It became acceptable because, well, my friend's going along with this, so it must be all right then. If he's doing it, I'll do it. And the more people that get involved in something, the more protected they feel. They would never do something like this on their own.
After school, 20 students from St Charles College travelled by bus to Victoria Station. They planned to confront the other group, and they were heavily armed.
They were armed with a variety of weapons, butcher steels, carving knives. Other people had brought knives from home. One of them had brought a stab vest.
The two rival groups spotted each other in the bus terminal of Victoria Station just after 5 p.m.
There was a very brief standoff in the middle of the bus station, and then there was a charge across the bus station by the St Charles College group.
The teenagers charged at each other in broad daylight in front of shocked commuters. They wielded a frightening array of weapons, including a samurai sword.
A young man with a samurai sword in a busy commuter station is such a bizarre image, for us to behold, but one that essentially culminated out of this frenzy that was developing throughout the day on social media.
The other group of school kids were outnumbered and outarmed by the St Charles College students, and they turned and fled. 15-year-old Sofian Balamuden was separated from this group and was chased into the ticket hall of Victoria Station.
He was pursued into the station concourse by several members of the St Charles College group. There he was surrounded.
There was sort of 4 or 5 kids, and 4 of them surrounded one boy and beat him. They beat him to the floor, they kicked him while he was down. The next thing, the knife's pulled out of a jacket. The kid's on his floor trying to right himself. They stabbed him to death.
He was kicked, punched, beaten and stabbed in front of dozens of commuters.
15-year-old Sofian Bellemouden died of his injuries just hours later. 20 teenagers from St. Charles College in West London were charged with his murder. They were all aged between 15 and 18. Detectives were surprised to discover that they were all well-educated and were promising students.
That pack mentality is going to make you behave in a way that you would never dream of behaving if you had simply been by yourself or simply accompanied by one of your friends. It tends to escalate your behavior rather than control your behavior.
They must have known that Victoria Station had CCTV throughout it. They must have known there were going to be hundreds of eyewitnesses.
It's very easy to kill in a pack. It's so easy because you're in a frenzy. You're just kicking, you're just stabbing, you know. They're not thinking straight.
Out of the 20 teenagers charged with murder, 14 were later convicted of lesser offences, but 3 were convicted of his murder and given life.
You've got these young men, a lot of them, who'd bright futures ahead of them, and they've thrown it all away.
Being part of a gang gives a sense of invulnerability, of invincibility. It makes you behave in a de-individuated way.
When they're within that social group, the behaviour becomes normalised, that the violence becomes justified even.
It gives you courage that you might not have if you were simply by yourself.
A pack mentality can cause good kids to commit extreme acts of violence. But when children's behavior is unbelievably cruel and sadistic, it raises the question whether behavior is learnt or copied, or if children can actually be born bad.
Were the stones in the bath?
In the head.
Was he bleeding?
Oh, either.
It was cold, it was calculated, and it was evil, really.
When children act in extremely cruel and sadistic ways, it raises the question of whether they're born evil or they're a product of their upbringing. And one case has scarred Britain more than any other.
Following the abduction of James Bulger and the subsequent findings of his body on the railway line in Walton, 2 boys have been arrested by Merseyside police.
In February 1993, 2 10-year-old boys, Robert Thompson and John Venables, abducted 2-year-old James Bulger from a shopping centre in Liverpool. The grainy image of the toddler being led away by his hand has been ingrained on the public consciousness as an act of unparalleled evil.
It was a case that really did shock the nation, because when we saw the pictures of the 2 suspects, they were children themselves. They looked incredibly childlike in their school photographs. So this was something that we had real trouble making sense of.
Albert Kirby was head of the Serious Crime Squad in Liverpool, and in 1993 was the lead detective in the James Bulger investigation.
We know what happened to James. They walked him away to a scene where they knew they wouldn't be seen. It was covered, it was isolated, they knew the area.
The 2 boys tortured and killed James and left his tiny body on a railway line.
It was cold, it was calculated, and it was evil, really. A lot of people think, well, was it a prank? They were only kids, you know, they didn't know. That didn't apply in this case.
The level of violence used against him was extreme, and this extreme violence is also incredibly rare.
After James's body was found, you examine the severity of the injuries that had been inflicted upon him. You couldn't relate that to 2 young people. We all found it difficult to believe that anyone so young could have done what they did.
Albert Kirby and his team arrested Thompson and Venables. They were taken to separate police stations where they were interviewed.
I have a photograph here which is a video camera photograph. This is James.
That's me, that's right.
So the boy holding James's hand is you.
Yeah.
And the boy ahead of you
Is
in the dark jacket and trousers, Robert Thompson. What was it you told us?
that I killed James.
Think about it and just tell us what happened.
And he took me on the rail and stuff and started throwing bricks at him. And then
Who did?
Robbie
What else did he do apart from throwing bricks?
threw the big pole at him.
Threw a big pole at him?
Yeah.
Is that what you said?
That knocked him out
Where did the stones in the bar hit him?
in the head.
Was he bleeding?
All over.
Where was he bleeding from?
Face.
I think when you listened to the tapes, you realise just how young and immature they were.
I think they were clearly conscious of the fact that what they were doing was wrong. It was clear that they understood that it was they and they alone that had taken his life. And therefore, in that sense, I think they legally understood that they had murdered and therefore could be held accountable for what it was that they had done.
Why had these two boys carried out such a horrific attack?
We have to go back and look at, well, where did these two young boys come from? What was their upbringing like? And when we look at their family situations, the kind of behaviour that they came to accept as normal isn't the behaviour that you or I would accept as normal in family life. So there would have been almost a kind of tolerance and acceptance of violence as a particular way of behaving. So their upbringing played an important part in what unfolded.
They had no real empathy or sympathy for the child because they'd not been in an environment where empathy and sympathy was a typical way of responding to other people.
The trial of Venables and Thompson sparked huge public outrage, with many branding the boys evil. The judge decided to allow the boys to be identified so the whole country knew who they were. After a trial that lasted 17 days, the jury found Venables and Thompson guilty.
What James's murder made people accept more than ever is that young people do have the propensity to commit some pretty horrible and evil acts.
The country hoped that such terrible violence committed by children against other children would never be seen again. But on the 4th of April 2009, a 9-year-old boy was found covered in blood in Edlington near Doncaster. He and another young boy had been tortured by two brothers aged just 10 and 11 in a frightening attack.
The case in Edlington has some echoes of the Bulger case. Again, we're dealing with two children who encourage two younger boys to go with them to waste ground, where they're going to subject those two boys to a horrific attack.
They tortured these two boys, burning them with cigarettes, and the older boy, one of the two boys who was attacked by them, nearly died of his injuries. So whilst these children didn't commit murder, they certainly weren't far off from it.
Police found one of the boys laying face down in a muddy riverbank, covered in blood. They discovered that the two brothers, aged 10 and 11, had beaten, burnt, strangled, and sexually assaulted two 9-year-old friends in a sustained and terrible attack. In court, it was revealed the boys tortured their victims with any weapons they could lay their hands on, including sticks, broken glass, barbed wire, and cable. The court heard the brothers only stopped their attack because they became too tired.
We see a gradual escalation in the level of violence that these two young boys were committing, from animal cruelty in 2005 to pushing another child in front of a moving car in 2007. In 2008, they attacked a teacher.
The brothers were well known in the local area and were nicknamed the Devils.
I've read the serious case review of these assaults. It is quite clear that these two boys came from a profoundly dysfunctional family in which violence was the order of the day, in which there was chaotic, incoherent parenting. If you suddenly put those two boys from that kind of background into a set of circumstances in which they have power and control over two other boys, then frankly, that's a recipe for disaster.
The Edlington boys were convicted and are now serving an indeterminate custodial sentence, but in theory they could be released after only 5 years. The Bulger killers, Venables and Thompson, were controversially released from custody in 2001 after just 8 years and given new identities. But Albert Kirby wasn't confident of John Venables' chances.
Venables has always been a problem. I think the authorities failed in not identifying his vulnerability and insisting at 18 years of age that he be released.
And just as he feared, at the age of 26, John Venables was rearrested and recalled to prison for possessing child pornography. In September 2013, he was once again controversially re-released from prison. It reignited the debate over whether kids who kill can reintegrate into society, or could they be inherently evil?
I don't think that children are born evil. I think they are socialised to be evil.
All of us are not really born as civilized human beings. We learn to become human, and we do that through our contacts with other people.
We need to look at the environmental factors, the wider social problems, because it's not just about individual children, this is about us as a society. We are creating these individuals.
The environment children grow up in will affect their behavior, but there are many kids who have troubled backgrounds who never go on to commit crime. Nevertheless, when children do commit the most horrendous of acts, it challenges our beliefs about the innocence of childhood.
As long as we still have children being brought up in environments where there is chaotic or absent discipline, where they are not nurtured appropriately, sadly, there will still be incidents of children killing in our culture.
We've more crime on the way next tonight here on Channel 5. Stay tuned for CSI New York, coming right up.